Welcome to the last week of Paul's 3033. What an unique and unpredictable semester. Hopefully, you've gotten through it as I have, a little bit battered, but more resolved and more able to adapt to changing circumstances. I know I have really enjoyed going over the material in a whole bunch of different formats and trying to think about it in a different way, moving it online and hybrid. And hopefully, it has been engaging and that you've stuck with it to the bitter end. This is pretty close to the bitter end, except for your final essays, and I want to make sure that it's worth your time. I know as the semester progresses, it can be a little bit harder to stay engaged, especially when you don't actually have to physically go to a room in order to engage with the class material. So I've tried to keep this as relevant as the rest of the weeks of the semester, and I want to spend time today kind of looking at how the international community has tried to solve and deal with the issues that we've been touching on this semester, because I know that, like Cassandra and Chicken Little, we can see the future coming, and a lot of it is quite difficult in dealing with conflict and violence and repression and climate threats. But I wanted to spend this week talking about international responses, how they overlap with domestic responses, and how there are different areas in which there has been international cooperation. I wanted to spend time talking about three specific examples of that. International water basin cooperation. We've touched a little bit of that on the Water Week. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, an example of scientists from around the world coming together to synthesize our state of knowledge about the world related to climate change in order to better influence policy outcomes. And then the international responses to a changing Arctic. I think this one is really interesting and overlaps with a lot of topics that my students are interested in. I know you come from the international security background, politics, international relations, environmental studies, and I think the Arctic and the different issue areas related to the Arctic touches on a lot of things that you've come across in this class as well as your other classes. So let's get started. We're looking at international responses to the kind of challenges related to climate, human security, and conflict that we've seen so far this semester. And for me, another reason this week kind of gives me hope is because there are international efforts of cooperation that are still going on despite everything that we're going through in 2020. Our Oceans Conference is due to be held in Palau in December of 2020. Let's see if it actually goes on ahead. It'll be after the end of the semester, so keep an eye out for that. This is an annual conference in which you get major stakeholders, international governments coming together to make commitments related to our oceans. 70% of the world's surface, and an area that has seen some of the most dramatic effects of human habitation and activity, whether it is spreading of microplastics, the effect on fisheries around the world, or international pollution. I was in Louisiana when the Deepwater Horizon oil spill happened, and I'm quite aware of the ways that humans can have an impact on oceans, though often they're not quite seen. One thing that's interesting is Australia has attended. This is the conference last year in the Before Times in October of 2019. You see governments coming together from around the world and making commitments to different forms of gathering information and implementing policies that are protecting the world's oceans. Australia we made a series of commitments as well. I wanted to highlight three in particular and see whether you can see whether these commitments are necessarily unique to this effort or ways that you can see international efforts can be repackaged in different ways for different purposes. So the first commitment was on marine pollution. There was an update of the threat abatement plan prepared a decade earlier, how to prevent and mitigate impacts of marine debris. they announced that CSIRO is leading a project of 2 million Australian dollars to use modeling to document the distribution of plastics within the ocean. I don't know. I should really have looked into this project to see whether it was before this ocean conference or whether it's something that we had already kind of earmarked. But it's interesting to see the focus on research and gathering information about what's actually happening with human effects related to plastics in the ocean and what can be done about it. You've probably come across the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. There's the gyre that brings together plastics, the floating plastics, in one specific area in the Pacific. Second commitment that we're going to touch on is related to fisheries. U.S. probably an over $4 million Australian $1 million 4-year plan to increase capacity in Pacific Island countries to prevent, deter, and eliminate illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. Australia, of course, has a clear interest area in Pacific Island states. We've talked about that related to climate migration in earlier weeks, and so it's interesting the effect to try to reduce illegal fishing should also have follow-on effects and increasing capacity at the individual level to help adapt to changing patterns and to make sure that people can have livelihoods. So you can see a multi effect possible outcomes from this project. The last one and more general one on climate change. It's also the largest. The Climates and Ocean Support Program in the Pacific, also supporting Pacific Island countries to adapt and mitigate to the impacts of climate variability. To build capacity in Pacific Island countries, including meteorological and hydrological services, as we've seen with the weeks in the first couple weeks of the semester, that it can be difficult to gather good data, and also serves as building capacity as well as building research capacity. So you see multilateral efforts, though the Australian projects are definitely closer to home in areas that we might also have strategic or economic interests as well. The overall motivating question for today's discussion is what international responses have been developed to counter the kind of environmental, human security, and conflict causal stories that we've touched on over the remainder of the semester. Last week we talked about domestic responses to largely climate-related challenges, and this week we're going to look at international responses. And of course, these categories are not necessarily mutually exclusive, and you can have domestic responses that also have international ramifications. Fishing would definitely be an area that you could see multiple overlaps, because fish don't necessarily abide by international borders, and so also pollution as well. So you can have domestic and international responses overlapping each other. So yeah, we're going to be looking at international responses largely related to climate and to water. The water basins being the first issue, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and Overall Climate Knowledge, and how we, for the readings for today, looking at the IPCC report from 2014, and then also a really interesting response by Niles Petter-Gleditsch and co-authors, looking at some of the research limitations and the assumptions and the process of generating the report in order to see how that can affect the conclusions. So those, and then end with the Arctic region and international agreements related to that at both the international, national, and individual level, cooperative with Circumpolar Inuit Arctic Council. So let's get started. Oh, forgot to mention this. The international responses that we're going to be touching on today are going to vary in difficulty, starting with going it alone, sticking with domestic mitigation and adaptation. The U.S. seems to be following more of a path of going it alone in recent years, though the U.S. has a long history of wanting to go alone with international justice uh, landmine treaties, and a lot of other different areas, bilateral agreements and treaties, multilateral treaties, international organizations, international regimes, and then the largest and the most difficult, arguably, would be international norms. Now, norms that are already established are something you really don't have to do anything for. They're already there. But establishing new international norms to either protect vulnerable climate-affected populations or to create international regimes to prevent outcomes that or to adapt to new challenges, those would be more difficult. But so we're going to start with going alone and then go all the way to establishing international norms. And a lot of these climate initiatives have been launched increasingly over time. You can see this from a website that tracks climate initiatives dating back to 1980 that you have seen since 2010, and it varies year on year, but in the last decade we've seen a whole bunch of new initiatives at trying to deal with climate challenges. So was trying to end on a positive note and showing that there is growing realization about these challenges and the way that these challenges can spread across borders, and that can require multilateral negotiations and efforts to try to coordinate both domestic and international responses. So yeah, that's what we're gonna do. That's where we're gonna go. And for this week 12, let's go ahead and get started. Defining our terms, areas for cooperation, and challenges.